Hello everyone, welcome to the next chapter of the animal behavior course. Today we're going to be discussing the process of sexual selection. Sexual selection is an evolutionary process in which traits are favored if those traits improve an animal's ability to mate and reproduce. So if there's something that makes you more attractive to the opposite sex, then it should be selected for and increase in the population. Think about peacocks, for example. They have these huge, costly plume of feathers. If females find these attractive, which they do, then sexual selection will select for larger and larger feathers. Sexual selection, once it happens over a long time, can result in what we call sexual dimorphism, where males and females of a species look very different from one another. Today's lesson is to understand why this occurs. There are two types of sexual selection, intra and intersexual selection. Intraselection is between two individuals that are of the same sex. Intersexual selection is between individuals of different sexes, and this is what we would call mate choice. So let's start by discussing a key principle in the study of sexual selection. Females are unable to produce more than a certain number of offspring at a time, and she cannot become successful by mating with as many males as she wants. In contrast, a male is capable of fathering more offspring if he mates with several females. This leads us to a key distinction. A male's potential reproductive success is limited by the number of females that he can mate with, whereas a female's potential reproductive success is limited by how many eggs she can produce. This is what developed what we now know as the Bateman principle. According to Bateman's principle, this results in sexual selection, in which males compete with each other and females become the choosy sex in which they must choose which males to mate with. So why might this be the case though? Like, why are the females the choosy sex and the males the ones that are competing for it? Think about it in terms of maybe like cost of gametes or cost of reproduction. Natural selection has favored two types of gametes: small and quick gametes like sperm and large limited gametes like eggs. For gametes to be successful, they must find one another and produce a healthy zygote. Small gametes specialize in the former, while larger gametes specialize in the latter. Medium-sized gametes do neither, and so they were actually selected against. Because of this, we have a bimodal distribution of gametes. Females produce eggs, typically, and males produce sperm, typically. Because females produce the larger, less abundant eggs, they basically have possession of a very extremely invaluable resource. In contrast, each sperm requires much less energy to produce, and sperm are usually found in abundant quantities, so they're really cheap and they're inexpensive. Thus, while males often produce millions of sperm, creating the possibility that males can have an extraordinary amount of reproductive success, females' eggs are often the limiting resource, causing severe competition for this scarce resource. And this is what drives Bateman's principle. Females produce the limiting resource, so males must compete to access that resource. Now, Bateman's principle helps us to understand why different forms of sexual selection evolve. Typically, because of Bateman's principle, the most common form of intrasexual selection is male-male competition. In some cases, though, we also see female-female competition, but this is far less common. And why is that? Well, the answer lies in the different risks and investments faced by males and females. Females generally have much more to lose by making a poor mating choice, especially in species with long gestation periods or that produce only a few offspring. If a female is going to devote a significant amount of time and energy to building, carrying, and raising offspring, it needs to make sure that it makes the right choice. As a result, females often let males compete directly with one another through fighting, displays, or contests, and then they mate with the winner. In other words, females rely on male-male competition as a filter to ensure that they invest in offspring with the highest quality mate. Now, sexual selection drives the evolution of traits that differ between males and females. This is called sexual dimorphism, the thing that I mentioned earlier on in the lecture. These differences come in two forms: primary and secondary sexual characteristics. Primary sexual characteristics are characteristics that are directly involved in reproduction. So it's like the reproductive organs as well as the gametes themselves. I hope that it's pretty straightforward as to why males and females have developed different primary sex characteristics. So I'm not going to go into exactly why that happened, but I hope that that's pretty self-evident. In contrast, secondary sex characteristics are a little more puzzling. Secondary sexual characteristics are traits that distinguish the two sexes from one another, but they are not directly part of the reproductive system. These traits don't always help with survival, and in fact, they can actually be quite costly, but they do enhance reproductive success. Mandrills, as you can see here at the bottom of the screen, are a classic example. Adult males are much larger than females and develop striking red and blue coloration on their faces and on their butts. These are secondary sexual characteristics. They're not directly tied to survival, but they do play a huge role in reproduction, and it's believed that they can signal status of a good mate to females. One driving force of sexual selection is male-male competition. In many species, males battle or display to gain access to females or territories. One dramatic example of this is the northern elephant seal. Here, males can weigh around 11,000 pounds, while females weigh less than half of that at 4,000 pounds. This extreme size difference allows males to dominate harems, physically fighting rivals off to maintain control over access to multiple females. These battles drive the evolution of enormous size, strength, and aggressive behaviors in males. Now, for a long time, most studies of sexual selection focused on male-male competition. But about 30 years ago, the field shifted, and now female mate choice is actually the most heavily studied process of sexual selection. Studying how females choose their mates has become one of the most active areas of ethology. Researchers have developed 4 major evolutionary models to explain why females choose certain mates over others. Of course, in many species, the evolution of sexually selected traits can't be explained just by one model, and often there's sort of a lot of overlap or even a combination of mechanisms at work. But to keep things clear, we're going to look at these one at a time using case studies where a single model provides a really, really good explanation for what's going on. So we're going to start first with the most straightforward one, which is known as the direct benefits hypothesis. The direct benefits hypothesis states that females gain immediate material advantages from their mate choice. This leads to choosy females because females that are choosy will do better than her counterparts that are less choosy. And so basically the direct benefits hypothesis is basically saying females choose the mate that's going to provide them with the best direct and immediate benefits. A classic example of this occurs in scorpion flies. These are a group of insects in the genus Panorpa. Now, male scorpion flies present females with what's called a nuptial gift, which is typically like a dead insect or something that they've captured. A nuptial gift is just a broad term for any sort of resource that is given in exchange for mating. Now, during courtship, the male will offer their prey that they've captured to the female. If she accepts, then she feeds on the gift while they mate. Importantly, though, this means that the size and the quality of the gift will directly affect how long that the copulation takes. A larger prey item means that females spend more time feeding, which in turn gives the male more time to transfer sperm. Females show a clear preference for males that bring bigger or higher quality gifts because it gives them more nutrition, which is a direct benefit. And it also might even improve their own reproductive success. This is a nice illustration of how female choice can shape male behavior and morphology. Males that are better at hunters are better at acquiring gifts and are more likely to mate successfully, driving sexual selection in the population. And so let's look at this in a graph. Now, if a male arrives without a gift, the female immediately rejects him. She simply won't mate at all. But even when a male does bring prey, the size of the gift matters a lot, as you can see by the graphs here. Females will actively determine how long copulation lasts based on the direct benefits of the nuptial gift that they receive. When the gift is small, there's a clear positive relationship between prey size and copulation duration. With smaller gifts, it's usually the female who terminates copulation. She does this by pulling the tip of her abdomen away from the male once she's finished feeding. On the other hand, larger gifts result in much longer copulation times. And this is crucial because copulation time is directly linked to reproductive success. If you look here on this graph that is down on the right side, it says the number of sperm transferred on the y-axis and the duration of copulation in minutes on the x-axis. And you can see there's a clear positive relationship that as copulation lasts longer, more sperm is transferred. And this can ultimately increase the rate at which the males can produce more offspring, right? And so it's beneficial for the males to be able to copulate for longer. And so there's this direct benefit there for the males. So females that are actively choosing males that are bringing larger nuptial gifts provides multiple advantages. They produce more eggs and in all likelihood enjoy a longer lifespan. This is partly because they receive more nutrition directly from the gift, and partly because they spend less time and energy hunting for food themselves, right? So they're getting the direct benefits from the food, and then they don't have to spend energy to go hunt themselves. And so all of this really puts a strong selective pressure on males to bring the largest gift that they can. But capturing large prey isn't easy, it's time consuming, it's dangerous, and so it takes longer to forage, and there's sort of more of an increase in predation. So as a result, males have evolved some really interesting strategies. Sometimes they will even sample, like they'll catch a prey, they'll try it for themselves, see how big it is, and decide to discard it, even though they could have just consumed it. They decide to get rid of it because they don't feel that the female is going to see it as worthy, right? And so even though females never do this while they're hunting, the males do, and right? So this is an exact example of sort of a sexual selection playing a role on influencing male behavior. And so this, you can kind of just see this in these graphs here. I have a much more simple graph in the next slide, but you kind of really do need to know these graphs. The right graph is showing that the longer copulation occurs, the more sperm is transferred, and this left graph is showing that the size of the prey results in longer copulation as well. And so here's sort of what it looks like. The size of the nuptial gift with reproductive success on the y-axis. We'll see that these females sort of have this peak right around this medium to large size prey, and so that the males can have their best reproductive success by sort of matching onto that and bringing the largest gift that they can up until a certain point, right? And so you see sort of this sweet spot right here where any gifts larger than this aren't going to matter much than the gifts that are around that size. So males can sort of try to hone in on that little sweet spot there. All right. So not all nuptial gifts are as straightforward as a prey item, though. In some species, the gift is far more costly. In fact, sometimes the male sacrifices his own body to act as a nuptial gift. And so two animals that you're probably really familiar with are praying mantises and the black widow spider. Both species, either during or after mating, will feed themselves to the female. Literally turning their body into a nuptial gift. And so that's actually why black widows are called black widows, right? To mate, they must eat their mate, and then they become a widow themselves. And so that is actually where they got their name. And so here you can see in this graph in the bottom right that the larger a male's body is, the longer the female is able to feed. And this means, just like the scorpion flies, the more sperm that can be transferred to the female, and thus the male can produce more offspring. And so now obviously this comes at a huge cost to the male. He literally dies. So why in the world would he do this then? Think about it from an evolutionary perspective and try to understand why a male would do this. I'll give you a second to sort of think about that. Great. If you're still thinking about it, maybe jot an answer down, but go and pause the video if you need some more time. If you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it actually makes a lot of sense. Males that allow themselves to be consumed may actually be able to transfer more sperm to the female, increasing their chances of siring more and more offspring before they die. So although the sacrifice is extreme, it can actually boost a male's reproductive success by sacrificing himself so that he can produce more offspring and pass on his genes. Now, not all direct benefits are derived from gifts, though. For example, direct benefits can also come from the quality of a male's territory. So if we look at side-blotched lizards, females normally prefer larger males. But those males also tend to be able to control territories with more rocks, which are vital for basking, hiding from predators, and even laying eggs. So scientists were curious, is it the male size that the females prefer, or is it that females want a better territory? So let's go ahead and look at the results from an experiment, and I want you guys to be able to try and interpret what these results mean. All right, so here is the results. And so what they did for this experiment is they found a large male's territory, and then they removed all of the rocks from his territory and then provided those rocks to a male who was much smaller, right? So they took the rocks out of the large male's territory and gave it to the small male. And then they measured the number of females that would come through the territory and mate with each male. So what is the takeaway here? We can see that the large males with no rocks actually had fewer copulations or fewer number of females than the small males that were given rocks. And so when researchers moved these rocks, the females quickly changed their preference and chose the smaller males instead. So this experiment shows that female choice here isn't really about the male size. It's about the direct benefits of the territory that he can offer. All right, so that was one hypothesis, and it is probably the most straightforward. If a female chooses a mate, it's because there are direct benefits that are derived from choosing that mate, whether that be food or shelter. But there are other models of mate choice, and the next one is known as the good genes hypothesis. Now, the good genes hypothesis, and no, not these genes, states that females choose their mates based on traits that represent good genes. Essentially, this hypothesis says that females are looking for features that reflect a good genetic partner because their valuable eggs should only be fertilized by the best. This is all the goal of increasing survival of offspring, and if you can increase the survival of offspring, you can propagate your genes longer and longer into more and more generations. Let's look at sort of this classic example of what the good genes hypothesis sort of shows. Male bowerbirds are this beautiful and amazing and so strange species. What they do is they build these elaborate courtship structures called bowers. And then they decorate these bowers with colorful objects like flowers, shells, and even bits of like plastic trash. These bowers don't actually provide food, nor do they provide shelter or any sort of direct advantage to the female or her offspring. Instead, females just seem to choose males with the most elaborate and well-decorated bowers, probably because they display sort of acts as like a signal to good genetic quality. Building an intricate bower takes time, skill, and energy, so only the healthiest, fittest males can afford to do it really, really well. And so by choosing such males, females may be sort of ensuring that their offspring inherit the good genes of the males that can build these beautiful homes. Another classic example of the good genes hypothesis is found in elaborate courtship displays. They often look a little bit comical to us, like the extravagant dance of the birds of paradise you see on the left side, or the vibrant rhythmic displays of peacock spiders on the right. But they serve an important purpose. Just like the bowerbirds' nests, these displays offer no direct benefit to the female. Instead, they signal that the male is healthy and has the energy and genetic quality to invest in costly, showy traits. By choosing males with the most impressive displays, females may be increasing the chances that their offspring inherit those good genes. Now, before we finish with the good genes hypothesis, though, it's important to point out that this idea is controversial and raises a couple of key questions. First, how can females know which males truly have good genes? And second, how can they tell if a male is faking it or not? After all, natural selection should favor males that appear to have good genes, even if they don't, because this would increase their chances of mating. And so if this was the case and females had no way to sort of double check if the genes were actually being good, then males would instead be able to develop a strategy in which they fake these traits even though they don't have good genes. And so the answer, though, to these questions is yes. Males do evolve strategies to cheat or exaggerate their quality, but this sets up sort of an evolutionary arms race. In response, females evolve new strategies to detect and focus on signals that are costly and difficult to fake. And these are what we call honest indicators of genetic quality. Now, as long as females base their choices on honest signals, then they can overcome this cheating problem, at least temporarily. But because males and females keep evolving in response to one another, this dynamic is always shifting. And so more and more male strategies might come through to sort of try to get by, basically cheating and making it look like they have good genes without actually sort of investing in those costly traits. One influential solution to the cheater problem is the Zahavi handicap principle. Zahavi proposed that only signals that are costly to produce or maintain can be the honest indicators of genetic quality. The idea is simple. If a trait is expensive, for example, it makes survival harder, or it's just big and takes a lot of resources to create, then only the healthiest, highest quality males can afford to produce it. That cost ensures that the signal cannot be easily faked. And so a classic example of this is the peacock's giant feather plume tail. These tails are huge, heavy, and brightly colored, all of which should make the peacock more vulnerable to predators. Yet males with the largest, most extravagant tails are often the ones that females prefer. And so the fact that these males can survive despite such a handicap tells females something important. These males must be genetically superior. This is how costly traits remain as honest signals and how females can use them to select mates with truly good genes. But the question still remains, are they actually a sign of good genes? We don't really know if that's the case, and the females can't really register on with 23andMe and decide whether or not these are good genes, right? And so, yes, they are costly and they do handicap the animal, but there may be something else at play. So experimenters sought to sort of test this idea in peacocks. And so first they needed to show that female peacocks actually preferred males with bigger tails. So what they did is they took males with big tails and they covered up all of the eye spots on their tails so that the sort of the distinction of what the tails look like didn't really look the same anymore to the females. And then they wanted to see if this would basically make a popular male with these large tails that have all of these sort of eye spots on them, if they could make that popular male unpopular. And so let's take a look at the results from experiment 1. Do the females seem to choose males with more eye spots on their tails? Go ahead and pause for a second, take a look at this graph, and let me know what you think about this. If you need a little bit more time, you can go ahead and pause the video. But the answer is yes. As you can see, the males with a lot of eye spots had a large number of mates. However, once they remove those eye spots, the number of mates drastically decreased. And then finally, to make sure that it wasn't something to do with the procedure, right, they added those eye spots back onto the popular males that are now unpopular, and they once again became very, very popular. But do these big tails with lots of eye spots really mean they have better genes? Does it mean that these males are better at surviving? Well, to test this, researchers used an opportunistic and slightly tragic event. One year, a bunch of foxes had found their way into the park where researchers were studying peacocks. There was nothing they could do, but they decided to record and observe which males were actually surviving all of the foxes. If the males with the big tails were surviving more, then despite the large tails being a handicap, they must mean that males have good genes to survive. And here is exactly what they found. So, I ask you, are tails a good sign of good genes? The answer is yes, right? So we see that as male tail size increased, they had a higher percentage of survival from those foxes that had been introduced into the area. All right, so far we have covered direct benefits and the good gene hypothesis, but there are two other models of mate choice. And so the next one is runaway selection. So this powerful idea explains exaggerated sexual traits, and it is known as runaway selection. This model proposes that once a slight female preference for a particular male trait emerges, then if that trait is also heritable, then the two can become genetically linked. That is, the female's preference and the trait in the males can be genetically linked. Over generations, females continue to prefer that trait, and males with even more and more of it, or a better or more extreme versions of it, will become more preferred. So even if the trait doesn't provide any survival advantages, it can still be selected for in these very extreme and extravagant ways. And this sort of creates a positive feedback loop that looks a lot like this. The female preference starts here, and so males with this trait become better fit and move towards the female preference. Then females prefer more and more extreme versions of this trait, and the males keep improving and developing a more extreme version, right? And then we can sort of get this runaway selection. Now, this trait and the preference sort of reinforce each other. This is another way to think about it. The trait can evolve to become extremely exaggerated, and the female's preference for the trait can become more and more extreme. And so that's why we sometimes see these very elaborate features that seem to have little or no adaptive value beyond attracting mates. So let's take a closer look at how this runaway selection process can actually take place by looking at the example of long-tailed widow birds and sort of the preference and development of very long tails. Now, imagine a population of widow birds where females initially choose mates at random. Some males happen to have slightly longer tails, and these males actually are able to fly more skillfully and avoid predators just because something to do with the tail makes them better at that. This makes them survive for longer than the males that have short tails, and then that means that they can mate more often and produce more offspring. Now, suppose there's a gene in the females that makes them prefer longer-tailed males. By choosing a long-tailed male, a female will tend to have sons with longer tails and may even also have daughters that inherit the preference for long tails. Now, over generations and generations, this preference will spread through the population, right? And at first, longer tails were beneficial because they correlate with survival, but eventually, because of the preference and the longer tail trait in males become genetically linked, eventually this process can sort of run out of control. Female preference, rather than survival advantage, will then begin to drive the evolution of ever longer tails. And so in widow birds, this results in males with extremely long tail feathers. So long that they actually are starting to impair flight and maybe even reduce the survival of males. Yet females still prefer these males because sexual selection pushed them to sort of prefer these long tails, and the tails got longer and longer. And so this illustrates how female choice can sometimes override natural selection and lead to sort of these highly exaggerated male traits. This sort of illustrates exactly how female choice can sometimes override natural selection, leading to very, very exaggerated male traits. All right, and finally, our last model of mate choice is known as sensory exploitation. Here, the idea is that males evolve traits that take advantage of pre-existing sensory biases in females. That means that the female already has a preference or a heightened sensitivity to like a certain color, a pattern, maybe a stimulus, even before the males have ever evolved the trait. But then the males evolve it and end up exploiting it. Unlike the good genes hypothesis or the handicap models or even runaway selection, these male traits don't necessarily indicate genetic quality. They simply manipulate an existing preference to increase the male's mating success. Essentially, the male is sort of hacking the female's nervous system or sensory system to sort of take advantage of things that she already has a preference for. Now, a classic example of sensory exploitation actually comes from these little itty-bitty bugs known as water mites. Females in this species are highly sensitive to vibrations on the water surface because they indicate that a prey item has landed on the water. Males exploit this pre-existing bias by tapping the water in a way that mimics prey movements. The females respond to the vibrations thinking there's prey, but it actually turns out that there's a male there. And so it allows the male to sort of be in the right area at the right time to then mate with the female. And this shows how sensory exploitation sort of in action, how a male can gain reproductive success, not by offering a direct benefit or signaling good genes, but simply by taking advantage of a pre-existing sensory preference in the female. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap up. I know that that was a lot. And so we can summarize sort of each of these main models because these are really, really important for everybody to know. First, we have the direct benefits hypothesis. In this hypothesis, females choose mates that provide immediate advantages like food, territory, and protection. Second, the good genes or handicap sort of hypothesis shows that male traits can signal genetic quality and that costly traits are often the most honest indicators of fitness. Third, we have runaway selection. In this, female preference and male traits can become genetically linked, leading to exaggerated male traits, even if those traits reduce survival. Finally, we have sensory exploitation, and this is when males evolve traits that sort of tap into or hack the pre-existing sensory biases of females, gaining mating success without necessarily signaling genetic quality, and instead they're sort of just taking advantage of what females already prefer. So together these models illustrate the diverse ways that sexual selection shapes male traits, female preferences, and also the evolutionary dynamics across species and within species. I hope this was a very helpful lesson, and let me know if you have any questions.